Hello and welcome to the Global Dialogue series at Stanford Global Studies. My name is Jisha Menon and I am the Fisher Family Director of Stanford Global Studies. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our team behind the scenes, Christine Jeong, Stephanie Pitkiewicz, Simrat Mathru, Kristen Hara, and Kate Kuhns. We're also delighted to be working with Philosophy Talk on this event. We launched Global Dialogues last year with the aim of bringing leading scholars and thinkers to discuss critical issues across a transnational frame. Each quarter, we focus on a different topic organized under three large themes: concepts, connections, and crises. Today, we are very excited to discuss liberalism, a key concept that we associate with core values of human dignity, individual freedom, and equality, while we also explore the vicissitudes of this concept as it travels across the world, and we consider its relationship with empire and settler colonialism. We're excited to bring a stellar group of scholars to reflect on these issues, and without further ado, let me introduce our moderator for the event, who will get this conversation started. Professor Leif Wenar is the Olive H. Palmer Professor in Humanities at Stanford, and also by courtesy, Professor of Political Science and Professor of Law and Senior Fellow of Woods Institute for the Environment. He is the author of Blood, Oil, Tyrants, Violence, and the Rules That Run the World, and the Author Meets Critics volume, Beyond Blood, Oil, Philosophy, Policy, and the Future. And this work explores how oil resources can undermine democracy and discusses moral obligations of those who consume oil. His scholarship covers a range of topics from John Rawls to Hayek, from public philosophy to applied ethics, from the ethics of international trade to the ethics of philanthropy. In addition to his brilliant scholarship, Professor Wenar has contributed to numerous newspapers, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times. Professor Wenar is currently Lawrence S. Rockefeller Visiting Faculty Fellow at Princeton University's Center for Human Values, and I'm very grateful to him for agreeing to moderate this conversation during his sabbatical year. This very brief introduction, of course, fails to capture the range and brilliance of Professor Wenar's contributions as a scholar and public intellectual. Please find a longer introduction to his impactful scholarship and numerous accomplishments in the link posted in the chat function. Over to you, Leif.
Thanks so much, Jisha. I'm absolutely delighted to join you and everyone on the webinar for today's installment of Stanford's Global Dialogue series on liberalism and its global trajectories. Let me just set the stage with a simple historical observation. Whenever some group gains power, it becomes more likely that this group will seize control over economically and strategically valuable territory that's controlled by less powerful groups. We've seen this so many times in human history, for example, with the Arabs starting in the 7th century, the Mongols in the 13th century, the Aztecs in the 15th century. We continue to see it today, for example, with Russia's attempts to control Ukraine and with the Han Chinese settler colonialism in Uyghur territory. But our topic today is a Northern European version of this dynamic. Starting in the 18th century, Europeans, and especially the British, amassed extraordinary power, economically through developing capitalism, and politically through developing new technologies of violence and of governance. Given the power differential between Europeans and other groups, it became highly likely that Europeans would seize control over economically and strategically valuable territory. What makes that particular era so fascinating and paradoxical is its ideology. The difference in this historical episode is that the ideology of empire was so often liberalism. The liberal ideologies of Europeans, and especially the British, meant that in this particular imperial episode, those engaged in conquest spoke the language of peace. Those requiring subjugation spoke the language of freedom. Those enforcing hierarchies kept talking about equality. And the champions of toleration were often motivated by the most extreme racial and religious chauvinism. So those tensions between action and ideology have propelled a huge amount of historical research, as well as reflections on contemporary politics, not least about the United States. And we're so very fortunate today to have with us three extraordinary intellectuals who are also three of today's defining scholars of liberalism and empire. Our three distinguished speakers have asked me to be extremely brief with their biographies to leave more time for our discussions together. But please let me say that they're all much more distinguished than I am. And if you'd like to get more details about their fascinating research and their very distinguished careers, please look in the box where the links for their details will come up. We'll have our discussions one by one of our three speakers. They'll interact together, and then we'll throw open the discussion for our group interactions. So let me introduce our distinguished participants. Uday Mehta is Distinguished Professor of Political Science at the CUNY Graduate Center and the author of the book, Liberalism and Empire, A Study in 19th Century British Liberal Thought. Jennifer Pitts is Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago and the author of A Turn to Empire, The Rise of Imperial Liberalism in Britain and France. And Duncan Bell is Professor of Political Thought and International Relations in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge, and the author of Reordering the World, Essays on Liberalism and Empire. So to start us off, let me now invite Uday Mehta to kick us off with his reflections on this topic that he has done so much to bring to the world's attention. Uday.
Thank you, Leif. And thank you, the audience. My comments will focus on the British liberal tradition and its link with the empire. Only in the conclusion will I say anything about the contemporary world. With few exceptions, all the major British thinkers wrote about this link. They included John Locke in the mid-17th century, who wrote about America. In fact, he authored the Constitution of Carolina, held shares in the Royal African Company, both of which were implicated with slavery. The other major thinkers who had links with the British Empire included Edmund Burke, Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, James Mill and his son John Stuart Mill, Lord Macaulay, Sir Henry Maine, and less systematically, David Hume, David Ricardo, Thomas Carlyle, John Bright, and Walter Bagehot. More recently, Michael Oakeshott, all of whom were, in some sense, liberals. From the late 18th to the 19th century, the British Empire included America, much of Africa, South Asia, small islands sprinkled all over the world. About this geographical mass, it really was true to say the sun never set on it. Or, as the famous British historian J.R. Seeley said in late 19th century, the history of England was not in England, but in America and Asia. What made it liberal? In the Anglo-American tradition, liberalism is typically associated with ideas and practices that feature the importance of freedom and equality, which themselves are associated with a wide if not universal franchise with representation, individual rights, especially the right to free speech, the protection of property, and from the 19th century, the rights of minorities, and more generally, toleration. This protection of rights of minority and toleration were by no means universally true for liberals, and were certainly not true prior to the 19th century. Again, as a general matter, liberals tended to look with favor on self-determination, which they typically did without reflecting deeply on it. In terms of its mood, as distinct from its doctrine, liberals tended to be romantic by insisting that social goods came from subjective energy, even when it leaned towards an eccentricity. In effect, liberalism laid out the broad strokes of what today we call democratic governance. Yet in the empire, liberalism was anything but democratic. It was plainly exclusionary, operated through limited franchise, occasionally was cruel, expansionistic, with a penchant for the use of force, power, and force. That is not to say that it was self-contradictory. It was not. Liberalism has always had resources with which to cover such apparent contradictions. As early as the 19th century, when Locke set out the basic argument for democratic governments, which later came to anchor democratic practice, the argument for democracy turned on having freedom, because democracy itself ultimately required choosing. But freedom required knowing the limits of freedom, because in its absence, or in the absence of knowing such limits, liberalism, by emphasizing choice, could assume an anarchical form. Reason, on this liberal account, supplied an awareness of these limits. It is only by being rational that we know the appropriate limits to our freedom. Hence, there is an important link between being rational and being free. A similar argument was made by other kinds of liberal thinking, such as utilitarianism. The ability to reason is the linchpin that connects liberalism with empire. For democracy to be liberal, it had to establish a deep connection with reasons. Where people were thought not to be rational, there had to be some mechanism to make them rational. And that mechanism was the empire. The empire supplied, as John Stuart Mill famously said, the leading strings that assisted people and societies to walk. The empire, in effect, was an educational framework for those who did not manifest the appropriate muscularity of reason. When one think of a child who is about to put her finger in a flame. Parents or those who are concerned adults would, of course, try and make her aware that such an act would hurt her. Why it was not in her interest. They could do that forcibly by pulling her hand away from the fire or teaching her gently why such an act was inappropriate. Liberals did both things. Occasionally they used force, which they thought, when they thought it would produce quicker results, and sometimes they used gentler methods for making people rational, such as establish educational institutions. Of course, there were others who thought in similar ways, who operated broadly within the same conceptual umbrella, such as Christian missionaries. The former British Empire is replete with educational institutions with Christian names, such as St. Paul's, or St. Mary's, or just Jesus. And similarly, there are institutions with entirely secular names, such as Mayo College. Lord Mayo was the Governor General of India. And often there are educational institutions named after military figures. In all these cases, liberals were exporting a way of thinking, which sometimes involved the use of force and other times confined itself to other methods. These different ways of thinking and acting had links to different times. If it was thought something required urgent action, typically force and violence were used. Or, on the other hand, if what had to be changed was an entire way of life, educational or slower means were deployed. Think of the empire as an extended system of reform schools. As with most reform schools, a mix of methods is deployed. Learning is combined with punishing. This was broadly true of the British Empire. It deployed a range of methods to establish its conception of the world. I think this is where I should segue to speaking about the present. Contemporary democracies think in similar ways and deploy the same tools. Sometimes they use force and go to war. Other times they do development and educational work. On occasions, they thought of on occasions their thought they thought of on occasions their thought is an export commodity. At other times, they try and achieve the same goals through slower methods, such as changing culture from the inside. These are strategies of exclusion, but simultaneously also of inclusion. And because they are, often liberals tend to be put, because they have impulses that pull them in different directions. I myself am such a tortured liberal. When I see a child about to put her hand in a flame, I'm liable to forcefully pull it away. Only then will I proceed to explain why I did that and why I think it was in her interest for me to have done that. Paternalism is an integral part of being liberal. I think the only way to avoid such paternalism is to be patient, like Gandhi was. His critique of empire eschewed violence because he thought most forms of violence in the model world were expressions of impatience. Finally, I should mention there is another group of thinkers who shared liberalism's ideals, but not its methods. They too had a deep commitment to freedom. For them, liberal ideas were indeed universal, but not governed by similar rules for achieving them. They had a vision of the world linked to different temporalities. Some things just had to be acknowledged as being different ways of living, a different life form. The terms that were central to this vision were imagination and eccentricity rather than reason, patience rather than progress, poetry rather than science, the crooked rather than the straight, the locality rather than the world, practices rather than ideas. For them, the ideals of liberalism were exportable too, but only by being patient and with arduous effort, because they were not backed by anything. The world offered no prior assurances. This liberalism felt most at home, in large part because it had a home, by being rooted in a specific place. Its only global trajectory was more modest, typically evident in persons of great cultivation. This kind of liberalism was espoused by thinkers such as Edmund Burke in the 18th century, Michael Oakeshott, and Gandhi more recently. To you now, Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Uday. As Uday's remarks have so powerfully conveyed, liberalism as a tradition of thought and also the liberal nation state have been profoundly shaped by empire. And modern imperialism, for its part, has been in significant part the work of liberal concepts, categories, and justifications. So liberalism and empire are co-constitutive. The modern world order, with its deeply asymmetrical power relations, coercive political and economic control that takes place under the cover of the rule of law, and an enduring global color line, was constructed under the hegemony of the liberal powers, above all the British Empire and the United States. It's ironic, but also no accident, that the most powerful states in modern history have been liberal empires that exercised, as Uday has said, violent and unaccountable power over hundreds of millions of subject peoples even as they profess their commitments to freedom and progress. Liberalism is remarkably elastic and flexible, and this flexibility has been important in making liberal imperialism so enduring, since even as it is in crucial ways unstable, if not precisely self-contradictory, it has also continued to evade criticism and accountability. Given the complexity and the elasticity of liberalism, there are pitfalls of generalizing about its bedrock commitments, but I would highlight two key recurrent features of imperial liberalism. First, what I would call provincial universalism, that is a belief that liberals have discovered universally valid moral principles that are binding on all people, alongside a failure to recognize the necessarily local histories and particular features of those principles. Along with this has gone an assumption that liberal culture is the only possible source of universal moral truths, and that where everyone else's culture is particular, liberalism is the sole universalism. And I would note also that this provincial universalism didn't originate with liberalism. You see versions of it, earlier iterations of it in, for instance, the Stoicism that developed in the Roman Empire, earlier crusading forms of Christianity. But it's reached a kind of particular apogee with liberalism. Secondly, and relatedly, developmentalism, which justified despotism in the name of progress and civilization, again, as Uday has discussed. This despotism was supposedly temporary in preparation for a transition to self-government, but with a vague and ever-deferred endpoint. Liberal empires insist that they exercise power for the benefit of their subjects. These subjects are often infantilized. Those who resist are delegitimated as irrational, as opposing universal values, and therefore making themselves enemies of humanity, and as setting themselves against the course of history itself. This developmentalism, I think, has been an ideological key to liberal imperialism's flexibility, because it can be mobilized to defend almost any deviation from universal principles as a temporary matter and in the name of progress toward liberal ends, and for the sake of those who are subjected to the violence in such deviations. I would just note also, given that racial hierarchy has been such a central feature of the global order under liberal hegemony, that liberal developmentalism has had a complicated relationship to racism. Many important 19th century imperial liberals, people like John Stuart Mill and Alexis de Tocqueville, were explicit opponents of biological racism, and in principle, they were committed to the equality of all human beings. But they also believed that cultural differences among peoples were deep-rooted, and their hierarchical ranking of peoples also tracked overtly racial hierarchies. And as white supremacy became an increasingly prominent feature of European imperialism, liberal thought further contributed to racial domination in, I think, at least two ways. First, liberal thinkers adopted increasingly overt forms of racial essentialism. And at the same time, the formal egalitarianism of liberal categories tended to obfuscate dynamics of racial domination, and they could hide behind a kind of formal equality and a refusal to recognize systematic racial domination and the global color line. So these commitments to hierarchy and violence justified in the name of universal values are, I think, some of the most important features of liberalism and liberal imperialism as a historical phenomenon. But it's also the case that tensions among liberalism's commitments have also made some productive space for resistance against liberal empire. Law could be a resource for vulnerable groups, and anti-imperial movements could invoke liberal empire's own moral commitments on behalf of their emancipation with, however limited success. The late philosopher Charles Mills has been, I think, one of the most eloquent thinkers in recent years to try to recuperate liberalism from its historical entanglements with empire and racial domination for radical and anti-racist ends. He identifies four features of liberalism: its individualism, egalitarianism, universalism, and progressivism, and argues that although the historically dominant configurations of these values have been imperial and racialized, in his words, liberalism can be retrieved, but it will take political struggle to do so. I want to turn now from liberal imperialism or imperial liberalism as a body of thought to liberalism as a form of rule, which has similarly been a constantly shifting phenomenon, a protean, elastic form. Liberal empires existed not only as formal conquest and rule, but also, and even more persistently, in many kinds of informal empire and through a racial global hierarchy that has persisted across these many forms. As W.E.B. Du Bois put this point in the early 1920s, white imperialism today knows that conquest is only one method of domination. As he also said, there are many ways to skin a cat. I said at the beginning that it's ironic, but also no accident, that the most powerful states in modern history have been liberal empires. And I think the outsized power of liberal empires in modern history is in part due precisely to this flexibility. So I want to make 4 brief points about this connection between the flexibility and the power of liberal empires in the time remaining. First, the rise of liberal democracy in imperial metropoles and white settler colonies was directly parasitic on imperial domination. The sharing of imperial spoils eased social conflict within Europe and made possible increasing democratization. At the same time, these states and their citizens were able to see themselves as fundamentally separate from and only contingently connected to their empires, as committed to the peaceful coexistence of like-minded nations, as Woodrow Wilson put it in his 14 Points address. This Janus-faced quality of the imperial nation state continued under new forms of liberal imperial relations, from the League of Nations mandate system to the domination of formally independent post-colonial states through financial instruments and their unequal integration into structures of international law, which continues today. Second is the connection between liberalism and capitalism, and there's much more to say about this than I can possibly say now, but I'll just make a couple of points. A recurrent feature of liberal empires has been the collaboration between state officials and nominally private actors, especially corporations, from the early joint stock monopoly trading companies to 20th century corporations involved in extractive industries and agricultural commodities. And these collaborations served a number of purposes for the liberal state, as well as for the population in the metropole. They generated unrivaled power for the state, as well as wealth for the merchants. They allowed the state and the public to evade responsibility by allowing nominally private agents to get out ahead of official state policy and create facts on the ground, with their conquests then retrospectively endorsed by the state. And more generally, colonial rule undertook systemic dispossession of indigenous peoples and generated property rights for European subjects and later colonial elites, with property rights being a key liberal commitment, as Uday has noted. International law, developed and largely controlled by imperial powers, legitimated and entrenched this massive transfer of wealth from the global south to the global north. So the kind of public-private partnership that has been a recurrent feature of liberal imperialism, I think, has contributed to this flexibility. Third, the fiction of the liberal empire as a bastion of the rule of law, and the relationship between law and lawlessness in the construction and conduct of liberal empires, I think, is a key feature. So territorial annexations by liberal empires have always been characterized by a tangle of legality and illegality. Imperial agents and colonial settlers and their state sponsors have sort of bootstrapped themselves into legal frameworks, acting illegally and then retrospectively legalizing their actions. Liberal imperialism's tangle of legality and illegality also took the form of what Caroline Elkins in her recent book, Legacy of Violence, called legalized lawlessness, which is the dynamic in which colonial violence produces laws that in turn legalize extraordinary acts of coercion and suspensions of due process. So this commitment to the rule of law alongside a persistent tendency to undermine it, I think, again, is a feature of liberal imperialism that has enabled its remarkable kind of Protean endurance. And then finally, I'll just end with that I think a feature of imperial liberal power that remains a major piece of the world order today is its refusal of accountability. So formal liberal imperialism was characterized by unaccountability to colonial subjects on the grounds that they weren't in a position to consent to government, whether because of their backwardness or their poverty, or because colonial populations were not yet a people who could act together in a political capacity. So that was one form of accountability. Informal imperial arrangements of the 20th century have taken different forms of unaccountability. For instance, the tendency to explanatory nationalism, to deeming problems in post-colonial states as caused by internal structures rather than an attention to the structural and international causes of poverty, conflict, and humanitarian crises. And I would just end by noting that the injustices and violence of authoritarian states, as Leif mentioned in his opening remarks, whether Russia's war on Ukraine or China's genocide against Uyghur and other populations in Xinjiang, makes it tempting to forestall a reckoning with the forms of domination that are particular to the liberal global order, which are less spectacular perhaps, but pervasive and enduring. And with that, I will hand it to Duncan.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Hello, everyone. Thanks to the team at Stanford Global Studies, Jisha, Simrath, and others for the invitation, to Leif for chairing, and to Uday and Jennifer for sharing this space with me. It's a particular pleasure to share a panel with Jennifer and Uday, as their scholarships had a deep influence on my own work on liberalism and empire in the last couple of decades or so. And what I'll be saying now builds in part on what they have to say, but maybe also heads off in some slightly different directions. So my own work in the last couple of decades is focused on dissecting British and American liberal visions of empire and international politics, rather than on the global history of liberalism, which is another way of talking about global trajectories of liberalism, the way in which liberalism has flowered or not flowered in different parts of the world, different times and places. I'm going to discuss instead two huge issues in a very short space of time. So of course, I'll not be able to do them proper justice. And the first of those is what is liberalism? And the second is a set of comments on liberalism and empire, with a particular focus on settler colonialism. So firstly, what is it that we mean by liberalism? The term is used very widely across different scholarly domains, in public discourse, in everyday vernaculars. And yet it's actually extremely hard to pin down a meaning that can be widely agreed upon. Liberalism, I suggest, is the meta-category of political thinking in the Western world, and it forms the main framework in which politics unfolds and is debated, including many arguments over exactly what shape that frame should assume. But this is a relatively recent achievement, and it's also arguably a fragile one. We don't live at the end of history. Liberalism, as it's typically understood today, at least in political theory terms and in other wider scholarly fields, is a political ideology with roots in early modern Europe, above all in the work of John Locke, often regarded as the father of liberalism. But this notion of the liberal tradition is, I would suggest, largely an invention of the 20th century. It would have actually been unintelligible to many 19th century thinkers. It was produced by retrospectively conscripting a variety of different ideological traditions, practices, and institutions, and synthesizing them into a formidable compound, liberal democracy, in the context of existential wars against fascism, Nazism, and communism. We in the Euro-American world, at least, are its inheritors. And it's sometimes very hard to stand outside of the tradition to try and make sense of it. Now, we should be alert to the implication of this historical story, or at least the implications. Liberalism, as Jennifer's already noted, is a shape-shifting, amorphous thing, composed of multiple different strands, many pulling in different directions, and even contradictory. Also, it's necessarily dynamic, changing over time and varied across space. In short, we should be very wary about the unqualified use of the term liberalism, of sweeping generalizations about what liberalism is, what follows from it, what kind of politics it prescribes, excludes, involves. We should always ask, what kind of liberalism? When? Where? This is, of course, even more imperative when we venture beyond the geographical and ideological confines of the West. The study of liberalism globally today is a massive project, one in which people have only really just begun to embark, and it's far beyond the abilities or knowledge of any single scholar. It'll take a team effort. And it will be different in different places. There will, of course, be connections, and much of the past of it is related to empire, although it can't be reduced to it. The trajectories of global liberalisms, in other words, are multiple and complex. This leads me on to my second theme, which is liberalism and empire. One of the central issues in the scholarly study of European and perhaps especially Anglo-American liberalism in recent decades has been the pivotal role of empire. It's been a central theme in understanding the global trajectories of Euro-American liberalism, of how, as it were, this tradition which emerges within a particular time and space goes global. Not only in terms of the actual practice of imperialism, but in the way in which the world and the peoples within it are imagined. Now, Uday and Jennifer have made hugely important contributions to the subject, and their scholarships help to shape the contours of the debate, and I'm not going to add much to what they have said today or in their writings. In a famous phrase, Uday suggested in his book, Liberalism and Empire, that in India, liberalism found the concrete place of its dreams. Jennifer, meanwhile, sketched some of the different strands that constitute the liberal tradition, looking at both imperial forms and some of its critics. And in more recent work, she's shown the important role of international law in rationalising and sometimes challenging imperial hierarchies. In my own work, I've tried to focus on a somewhat different topic, though a related one. And in the background is the point I made earlier, the variability and dynamism of liberalism. Liberal visions of the globe, including imperialism, are highly diverse and result in contradictory political imaginaries and projects. The liberal tradition provides intellectual resources for a variety of forms of imperialism, as well as for various forms of critique. In other words, both liberalism and imperialism assume different forms at different times and in different places, and we need to be attentive to those differences. We should also remember that liberalism itself was but one expression of universalizing, modernizing political visions that pervaded 19th century thought, nearly all of which were premised on hierarchical accounts of global order and employed some version of a civilizational, developmental argument to legitimate Euro-American superiority. Similar arguments could, for example, be made about much 19th century socialism and even Marxism. Perhaps liberalism, then, was only the most powerful expression of a deeper set of assumptions about time, about history, and about politics. But I want to make a further point. Insofar as Anglo-American liberalism had a concrete place of its dreams, I want to suggest that it was in settler colonialism. The dispossession of indigenous peoples, the permanent occupation of their land, and the creation of new political communities in their place. The fate, that is, of what we now know as, amongst other settler colonial societies, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. While 19th and 20th century British and American liberals were divided on the justifiability of the civilizing mission, and even more so on the occupation and rule of India and imperial spaces in Africa, the Middle East and the Caribbean, very few raised objections to settler colonialism. Most either accepted it or openly celebrated it. It was much more universally supported, in other words, amongst liberals than other forms of empire. And liberal thought ever since has found it much harder to make sense of the implications of settler colonialism than of other forms of imperialism, which liberal thinkers have often relegated to long past historical episodes, thus capable of being separated from the present in important ways. Liberalism, in other words, has inoculated itself in some respects against more blatant forms of empire, but has failed to engage properly with the legacies of settler colonialism. And that's because settler colonialism in many ways is much harder to deal with, because it's internal rather than external to the Anglo-American heartlands. And it's one of the toughest challenges facing liberal thinkers today. On that note, I'm going to hang back to Leif, and thanks for listening.
So much thanks to all three of you for those rich and fruitful reflections on liberalism and empire. At this point, let me invite everyone on this webinar to engage with the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and please start putting in your questions, thoughts you have for our distinguished panelists. And let me say that we'll start that open discussion in a few minutes. Let me first give our three panelists a chance to respond to each other if they like, if there was an idea that came up that was provocative or you'd like to continue. Please feel free.
So, Jennifer, I have a question for you. When you said that John Stuart Mill did not invoke the category of race, he does actually invoke that category in, I don't know, in chapter 16 of Considerations. I mean, he says, people of our blood are ready for democracy, and people of our blood, or who are not of our blood, are not ready for democracy. I think of that as a racial category. After all, blood is a racial category. So, what do you think of that?
Yeah, no, I didn't say that he didn't invoke the category of race. I think the category of race is very much in play in his thought. I think he was he set himself against certain kinds of biological racism, even as you say, he entertained lines of argument. I mean, what you've said is maybe Mill at his most biologically determinist, but I think also his account of the depth of cultural differences among peoples, including within Europe, but also especially, between Europeans and non-Europeans, his sense of the profundity of those differences, I think, is, essentially indistinguishable from biological racism. So my point was only that there, mid-19th century liberals, I think, and Tocqueville is another one who, found biological racism distasteful, were concerned about it. Mill said it required, further scientific inquiry to discover whether there were significant differences among races. So that's all. You're right. It's when one is speaking in 10 minutes, one tends to gloss over nuance. But so I don't disagree with what you said. My point was partly just to say also that it's subsequent liberals that become more overtly committed to racial essentialism, but that the way was paved by the kind of argument that Mill was making.
I've got a question for Uday, and just a quick thought about that question that's already been raised. I mean, in the 19th century in Britain, use of the term blood could mean different things. Sometimes it was meant literally, other times it was metaphorical. Just like the languages of race and nation were themselves deeply unstable. There was very little settled meaning. So the fact that someone refers to blood doesn't necessarily mean that they're invoking a biological argument, although they may well be, require further investigation. I actually think the distinction between biological and cultural accounts of race is often very unhelpful. I prefer a kind of notion of what I call biocultural assemblage in some of my other works, but it's partly unhelpful for the reason Jennifer mentions, which in a way is that it kind of doesn't matter actually in practice, because the same conclusions were often reached on the basis of it. But at least at a conceptual
really the
level,
point
at a conceptual level, it can be unhelpful. But my question to you, Dave, was about your alternative tradition. So I accept that Burke and Oakeshott, Gandhi, I think maybe a bit less straightforward, but that certainly Burke and Oakeshott can be seen as liberals, at least on a very broad definition of the term. But they're also, of course, typically seen as conservatives. Amongst the most important conservative thinkers. Burke only becomes seen as a conservative in the late 19th century, as it happens. Earlier, he was a liberal hero and he was a self-described Whig. Oakeshott, his own self-positioning is intriguing, but at least in the way that people carve up political space today, these are seen as two canonical conservatives. And so my question is, do you see that maybe a form of liberal conservatism, should we call it, offers the best resources for the critique of liberal empire, or are there other kinds of liberalism that might be as open to forms of imagination, a kind of post-structural liberalism, for example, that's skeptical of strong universalizing moves, sort of Rawtian, I don't know, or some version of that might also be equally useful to challenge?
Duncan, thank you. So Duncan, thank you for your question. I mean, one of the things I think is problematic about the typical characterization of people like Burke or Oakeshott is to think that they were conservatives. But both had a deep commitment to things like, so I don't think of Burke nor of Oakeshott as conservatives. I mean, I know that's a polemical claim, but I think people should be open to that.
I, in turn, have a question for Duncan, if I may, which is just about the really important and interesting points you made at the end about settler colonialism. I guess one way to put the point is, you said liberalism is to some degree inoculated itself from other forms of empire, but not settler colonialism. I mean, to what degree is that because the practical implications of actual decolonization from settler colonialism are, unimaginable, or such would involve such a radical transformation of states like my own that people have sort of practically not been able to come to grips with it, versus something else, some theoretical aspect of it, or.
I think that's central. I don't think that's the only explanation, but yeah, it seems to me that that's a key factor, that there's a kind of unwillingness to face up to the truly radical consequences of what it would mean to, say, run hardcore arguments about historical injustice through a settler colonial lens, rather than, about the British occupation of India, say. There's a sense in which it's the empire of the kind of more conventional kind, as it was understood, has been externalized and historicized. It might have legacies in the present in all kinds of ways, both domestically in Britain and around the world, but it's nevertheless a separate phase of history in a different part of the world, and it can be engaged with at that level. Whereas obviously, when you're talking about settler societies, including the United States, but also Canada, Australia, and so on, the very society itself is the product of that imperial dispossession. And so it can't be engaged in the same way conceptually or practically. And so it's one of the reasons, at least, why I think liberals have failed to take account of it. But the other is that I think liberals, in many ways, have remained less bothered by settler colonialism as a form of activity, a practice, than they were by other kinds of imperialism. Most liberals today, at least, are critical of formal kinds of empire. Of course, there are arguments can be made about humanitarian intervention, forms of liberal governmentality as the latest iterations of kinds of imperial governance, very well known. But most liberals today won't defend 19th century liberal imperialism. Settler colonialism, as I say, it tends to be further away from these debates. And I think it's just harder to deal with for a variety of reasons. There are, of course, liberal scholars, people like Duncan Iverson, Jim Tully, who've begun to push in that direction. So I certainly don't want to suggest it's not being engaged at all. But it's always struck me that it's often, as it were, the kind of slightly easier issues to deal with that are those that are picked and run with.
But thanks so much. And I can't resist asking a bibliographical question, since you three are such prominent figures in this field and your expertise is absolutely overwhelming. I was wondering if there are people in the webinar who are getting into these topics, really coming to these debates, especially on figures that they might already know. What would you recommend? So I'm thinking particularly of John Locke and John Stuart Mill. And Locke is well known. The story we tell is he had a great influence on the founders of the United States. John Stuart Mill is brought up whenever free speech comes up. These figures are on syllabi, but people might not be familiar with their interactions with empire. So if you were to recommend a piece on Locke and on Mill, either a primary text or something that one of you has written, to get people more into the discussion of Locke and Mill and empire, is there something that comes to mind as a really good entry point for either of those figures?
I would recommend Uday's book.
And Jennifer's books.
Too easy.
Yeah. Can I add one more thing? I would also suggest that in a way, so there's different ways of studying this. One is to look at canonical figures in the history of political thought. So Locke, Adam Smith, Mill, whatever. And I've written on Mill and others. I've done this myself. But they're, of course, only a small part of the story, maybe a disproportionately influential group of individuals. But I would suggest a kind of much wider corpus of texts and of activities need to be addressed in order to kind of track the patterns. And so some of the most influential thinkers in the late 19th century in particular were people that we barely know today, like the historian who they mentioned, J.R. Seeley. No one reads him today, but probably the leading imperial ideologue in late 19th century Britain. So they're not canonical political theorists. But yes, in terms of Locke and Mill and others, I would recommend Jennifer and Uday's books as a starting place.
So Leif, when I teach Mill, I typically start with On Liberty. And I point to a particular passage immediately after Mill has articulated the principle of liberty, he says, in the paragraph following that, he says, this principle has no application to people who live under, who have not achieved, who are still in their condition of nonage. That's the word he uses. And they haven't acquired the maturity of their faculties. And then he says, until such time, they must live under a Charlemagne or an Akbar, if they are so lucky to have one. So he, in this passage, the first part of this is immediately after which is expansive, it doesn't have any limitations in it. And immediately after that, he says, don't think this applies to people who are not in the maturity of their faculties. So I find that to be a very significant part. I mean, he says things, as I mentioned, in considerations in chapters 16 and 17, where he says, you know, this idea of representation, it has no application to people who are not of our blood. The other passage, the last paragraph of Wealth of Nations challenges that view. It says, in effect, we have no business having an empire. We shouldn't be there. And yet, in other ways, Adam Smith is a liberal. Those are the places I would turn to. And of course, there are many passages.
I wish we could all just start with your class and sit in on your class. It sounds absolutely fantastic.
Oh, no. None of you need to be in my class.
Maybe I could just mention the books again, Uday's book, Liberalism and Empire, Jennifer's book, A Turn to Empire, and Duncan's book, Reordering the World. These would be the greatest books to read if you're approaching this subject from start. We have some fantastic questions in the Q&A, and let me again encourage people to participate with these stimulating thoughts by going to the Q&A box and putting in. If it's okay with you, I will now turn to some of the questions coming in from the participants in the discussion. Steve Diamond, I think this is something that came up in Jennifer's remarks. Have any of you engaged with the famous critique of the rule of law by Morton Horowitz in his review of the work on E.P. Thompson, who had called the rule of law an unqualified human good?
I haven't. I know E.P. Thompson's work, and I admire him as a historian, but I haven't.
How about the thought that the rule of law is an unqualified human good?
Well, it depends who creates the laws. I mean, that speaks to that point that Jennifer mentioned in recent work. I mean, you know, liberal imperial powers, British amongst others, created legal systems to help justify their rule. So unqualified, at least from my perspective, no. It can be good in some contexts, and it's not, but not in others.
I guess I would just add, and this is to echo something I said before, but that mechanisms of accountability are essential. And when you have the imposition of, you know, the rule of law, as Duncan said, it may be, you know, maybe a form of despotism. And if there's no mechanism of accountability by which those who are subject to such law can engage with its formation and protest, and then it can't possibly be an unqualified good. Whether unaccountable rule of law, is a oxymoron, maybe would be the direction that one could go. Does the rule of law, inherently require mechanisms of redress and accountability?
Jennifer, I know you've done awful lot of work on international law in the last decade. Is there a place that someone who's interested in liberalism and international law could go in your work to get an entry on that subject?
There's so much great work on the entanglements of international law and empire. I would say Anthony Angi's 2005 book on imperialism and sovereignty is a really profound reflection on that history. That's where I would send.
I would like to ask.
Go ahead.
I would like to ask a question to my fellow panelists. Do you both think that liberalism is very easy to avoid in this day and age?
So maybe I can answer that by then also answering a question from Joanna Sabala and also Sam Moyne's question on the list, since they're all related. So as I suggested at the beginning of the talk, and it's an argument that draws on an article I wrote called "What is Liberalism?" which came out a few years ago. I mean, I argue there that essentially, at least in the Western world, Euro-Atlantic world, maybe above all, we're pretty much all conscripts of liberalism, terminology I use. So I think it's very, very hard indeed to escape being a liberal in some case, some way or another, in the present, time, in a place in which many of us are based. I'm not making a claim about much of the rest of the world, I should add. I'm talking very much about the broadly Euro-American world. Now, that doesn't mean I don't think that liberalism has an outside. It clearly does. But it's not an outside that until very recently, and this is partly going to Sam's point, has got anywhere near the kind of commanding heights of the system. And then there's a historical argument about this. Liberalism in 1900, even in 1930, was a heavily contested position. There were live options either side of it and challenging it, not least communism, Nazism, fascism. Of course, across the 20th century, these are defeated one after the other. It gives Fukuyama then his end of history thesis, which I think is wrong in various ways. But empirically, by the end of the century, liberalism dominates this space. And in many ways, as I say, we're conscripts of liberalism. So do I self-describe as a liberal? Well, depends what you mean by that. But in a sense, I think it's inescapable for many people. I think Marxism remains outside of liberalism, but I think most socialists self-described in the Western world can fit within liberalism insofar as most of them endorse some version of liberal democratic order. So to Sam's point, I mean, in that article, I would maybe, if I wrote it today, maybe slightly water down the claim about the hegemony of liberalism, because clearly with Trump and many of his followers, I do see that as a challenge. I don't think it's been a successful challenge yet, but I'm not enormously hopeful for the future. That's why I was stressing the fragility of this dominance at the beginning of my talk. So, yeah, I mean, I'm fairly pessimistic as it happens about future trajectories. I definitely don't think liberalism is here to stay as the dominant ideology necessarily, right? It might be, but there's no guarantees there. So anyway, that I hope answers all of your questions. I think, yeah, standing outside liberalism is very hard. Finally, that's why I would agree that today, at least, Oakeshott is a liberal. He might also be a conservative. I don't think they're antithetical traditions. I also think Burke has become a liberal. I think Locke has become a liberal, and others. They too have been conscripted to liberalism, even if they might not have seen themselves as liberals, because liberal has conceptually and ideologically expanded massively across time, so that it's encompassed many other positions: social democracy, Christian democracy, democratic socialism, liberal socialism, libertarianism, so on and so forth. They're all part of liberalism, on my account at least.
The participants in the webinar are understandably very interested in your views on current events. So can I keep this current conversation going by adding a couple more questions that have come in? First, Brian Evans says, clearly there have been many illiberal actions by liberal imperialists, but to bring this up to our current situations, do the panelists feel defending an American hegemony is appropriate in the face of a rising China, or are those fears overstated? And then second, relatedly, Sherry and George, The imperial history these speakers refer to has been weaponized by today's autocratic regimes to justify their illiberal rule. They quite effectively dismiss liberal democracy as a hypocritical and tainted tradition. What are the panelists' thoughts on how liberal values can be rescued from this history?
I guess I would just start by saying, I think, it's precisely because it's so, liberalism is so vulnerable to cynical, not only because, but it is the case that liberalism, because its tradition, its history of presiding over the construction of a world order that is so unjust, makes it vulnerable to cynical critiques by authoritarians who have no investment in improving the lot of those who have suffered from the current global order. That insisting on the autocritique of liberalism is so crucial. It doesn't mean that those cynical appropriations of the criticisms are convincing, but they're rhetorically powerful. Sorry, so someone else maybe wants to take over. I had another thought.
I mean, I could say I broadly agree with Jennifer there about the vital importance of an autocritique. I don't think the fact that other states or societies, people weaponize liberalism against itself is enough to generate that autocritique. I think the autocritique should come from other sources, as it were. Political ideas can always be weaponized, mobilized by your opponents, and there's only so much you can do about that, frankly. The reason to kind of autocritique liberalism is because of the wrongs that it's done and the implications that's had, both for liberalism itself, but also, more importantly, for many peoples around the world. And with the aim, hopefully, of constructing, if one wants to, forms of liberalism that are much more attentive to difference, variety, pluralism, and so on. One way of doing that is the kind of way that Uday has already pointed to. So going to the point about American hegemony and China, I mean, it very much depends what you mean by American hegemony. I certainly don't think that American liberals, which is to say what I think of as dominant American society, should roll over and let a Chinese political system, dominate it in any way. But nor do I think that America should continue to act in the way in the world that it has done for much of the last century or so, as broadly speaking, a liberal imperial power. So it's not that I've got any easy solutions to this. I'm not a scholar of contemporary foreign policy, but it seems to me that it's not an either or. There's ways of acting in the world that are much more perhaps sensitive to difference and variety, that can nevertheless allow you to defend values at home without necessarily attempting to spread them abroad. And that does require a tampering down a bit of the strong universalism and developmentalist views that have underlain lots of liberal practice in the last couple of centuries. But where exactly you draw that line and how much you damp them down, I think, is a very complex question, because you don't either want to be in a position where you simply say anything else can go. We have no grounds for critique. We have no grounds for challenging things that happen elsewhere in the world. It's a phenomenally complex question, which will ultimately be resolved, if anything, politically. I think hypothetical or theoretical solutions to it only get you so far. But that's, I realise, an unsatisfactory answer.
So Duncan, let me ask you, what do you think are those grounds?
Sorry, the grounds for what?
For making the distinctions between I mean, there was some distinction you said, and you said it's complicated where one draws those lines. And my question to you is, where would it not be complicated?
I mean, that I was referring to as the degree of to me, the kind of universalism, anti-universalism is a false binary. So the question is, what kind of universalism, what kind of progressivism, if you want to think of it like that, is most appropriate for thinking about global politics today, given what we know about the history of universalizing political projects, not just liberal ones. I say Soviet communism would be another example, Ordana Westad kind of visions of the Cold War as a global clash of these developmentalist civilizing mission views of society which wreaked havoc around the world. Right? We know that there are certain kinds of strong universalism, certain kinds of strong progressivism, which have been devastating globally. On the other hand, we don't want to get rid of universalism completely, even if that was conceptually possible, because presumably we want something like grounds for assessing and judging violations of human dignity, human rights in other parts of the world. We want to be able to make assessments and judgments. But do we then necessarily always follow them up with military force? Well, no, presumably not. That's what I'm talking about, the complexity. And I don't have any straightforward answer to it. I'm not sure anyone really does. All I'm saying is that that seems to be the problem facing, broadly speaking, liberals or progressives today, is to how to kind of try and learn the lesson of liberal imperialism, socialist imperialism too, without retreating to a kind of inward-looking nativist view, which basically says, you know, the rest of the world has nothing really to do with us. People can terrorize their populations if they want. We won't really interfere or intervene, say anything about it, judge or assess. So that's the complicated line I was pointing to, but not because I have any straightforward solutions. It's something that troubles me regularly, and you know, you'd probably get a different answer on me each day of the week.
Yeah, I mean, what I find complicated is we live in a world in which more or less every country claims to be represented. After all, Iran claims to be representative, and you know, so if these societies are representative, and I don't believe they are, how does one distinguish liberalism from anything else?
Yeah, I'll leave that for others to have a crack at.
I was just going to
go ahead, please, Jennifer.
Oh, just to add to what Duncan was saying about the complexities. I mean, I think there are two less complex features maybe of this landscape. One is the selective application of our supposedly universal commitments in defense of human rights, failure to pressure our allies, you know, the use of human rights claims as a geopolitical battering ram. So that is not so hard. And it's, you know, to think about how to apply commitments to human rights, which, you know, we have potentially more sway with allies as well. And also turning human rights critiques in on ourselves. I mean, Du Bois, again, taking the you know, commitments of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and turning them as a mirror on the United States in 1947 is one example, but could carry on. So a willingness to criticize liberal states themselves on human rights grounds and their autocratic allies would be one direction to sort of cut through some of the complexity. And then also scrutiny of the use of liberal discourse to support forms of impoverishment of post-colonial states. I think, you know, the language of good governance and the responsibility to protect, which are so, you know, often coercively applied to make states more amenable to penetration by capital based in the global north. That again it's not philosophically complex. It might be hard to pull off a radical transformation of that kind of action, but I think those are places that liberal powers in the US in particular could usefully turn its attention as a way of in this, you know, the course of this auto critique that we're recommending.
I would be happy to hear the three of you reflect further on that set of questions all day. We're getting a little bit short of time. I wanted to ask a question about the role of nationalism in liberal imperialism, which comes from Samuel Turner. Thank you, Samuel says, for the wonderful talk. I'm curious how we might slot nationalism into this discussion. Professor Bell mentioned that post-structural liberalism offers a way to be skeptical about the universalizing commitments of liberalism, but in historical practice, nationalism emerged as a key theoretical resource for anti-colonialists to contest imperial rule, though of course later it became exclusionary in many ways. So, question, what was the role of nationalism in the age of liberal imperialism? And can we view certain strands of nationalism as liberal or anti-liberal today?
That's a huge question. Two quick thoughts. I mean, one about the role of nationalism or nationality within liberal imperial justificatory arguments. So, I mean, this has been written about by both the other panelists too. Someone like Mill, for example, regards a sense of national self-determination, loosely defined, as it were, part of the goal of liberal imperialism, right? That nations, broadly construed, should have some kind of self-governance, but many of the uncivilized places of the world, as he saw them, lacked a sense of national self-consciousness that was capable of grounding that form of self-government, and that was part of the role of the civilizing mission. So Mill's vision of international order was ultimately, ideally, somewhere in the future, a world of nation states interacting peacefully, harmoniously with one another. And so, yeah, that was actually used as a justification for liberal imperialism by at least some liberal thinkers, particularly in the second half of the 19th century. But of course, the question is right that nationalism was also deployed by swathes of anti-colonial thinkers and activists during the 20th century to critique empire. I mean, nationalism is a multifaceted, Janus-faced kind of phenomenon, often with long-term problematic consequences, as noted. But it's worth suggesting, I mean, someone like Adam Gettichew's recent work is this, that it wasn't only, I mean, many anti-colonial thinkers were aware of the dangers of nationalism as well, and tried to develop other kinds of alternative to a world of nation states as the alternative to empire. So I don't, again, think that the nation was the only way that anti-colonial thinkers tried to generate a critique of empire. There were other ways too, but no doubt nationalism did play a role for a significant number of them.
I also was going to invoke Adam Gettichew's work in this light, and the complexity of the role of nationalism in relation to other world, visions of world order that were being pursued by anti-colonial thinkers in the middle of the 20th century. But I would also maybe bring in Timothy Snyder's recent arguments here about Ukraine and the kind of political project that he understands, the anti-colonial political project that he understands Ukraine as being involved in, which is, maybe you could call it a political nationalism that's, against a linguistic or ethno-nationalist vision that that the Russian war is prosecuting, and in favor of the idea of collective self-determination, but not along the lines that Mill and other theorists of nationalism in the 19th century turned to, shared language and sense of ethnic belonging.
I have this notion that liberalism cannot, precisely because of its universalism, it cannot give an account of why borders should exist. And that is crucial to nationalism. As far as I can see, none of these, Locke doesn't have a good answer to the question to somebody sitting in Paris, why can't I consent to your government? I don't think he has a good answer. He's presuming that societies are clearly articulated, and yet his ideas don't allow him that presumption. So I think liberals have to presume on the naturalness of nations. They can't give an account of borders.
Before we end, I'm so sorry, our time is running short. I do want to get at the two last questions, at least into the air, if not answered. I'm afraid there's not time to answer, but one backward-looking question from Valeria Vergani: how might we think about the ways in which religious ideology and myths of secular rationality figured into the formations of liberal empire? A huge set of issues there. And then forward-looking from Scott McLeod, how might information technology supersede liberalism's long entanglement with empire and settler colonialism, looking forward into where we're headed. So I think, Jisha, there's nothing to do except for hope that we can have a reunion event here and have our scholars address the continuing topics that are coming out of their fascinating research. I'm so sorry that we have to bring it to a close. Thank you so much to our panelists for such an extremely stimulating discussion. You can see how productive and fruitful their thoughts are. And let me just encourage everyone again to go to the link to follow up on more of their scholarship and their public engagements. Thanks also very much to Jisha Menon and to all of our wonderful hosts here at Stanford Global Studies for such an excellent event. And we hope that this discussion furthers more thought and reflections and more conversations on liberalism and empire and on all of the other vital global issues we've touched on today. Thank you so much.